The grand estate of the Whitmore family loomed over the hills like a forgotten relic of a bygone era. With its towering white pillars and sprawling gardens, the mansion was a symbol of wealth, power, and prestige. Yet, despite its grandeur, there was an eerie stillness about the place. The perfectly manicured hedges, the glistening fountain in the front yard, and the sweeping marble staircase inside all seemed to belong to a home that was more of a museum than a residence. To the world outside, Richard Whitmore was a powerful and influential businessman, a self-made millionaire who had built his empire from the ground up. He was known for his ruthless business tactics and impeccable public image. But there was one thing about the Whitmore estate that had puzzled the small town of West Haven for years. His wife, Eleanor Whitmore, had not been seen in public for more than a decade. Rumors swirled. Some said she had fallen gravely ill and was bedridden. Others whispered of a tragic accident that had left her disfigured, too ashamed to show her face to the world. But the most chilling theory was that she had simply disappeared. Meet Clara. The new maid Clara Dawson was 23 years old when she first set foot in the Whitmore mansion. Fresh out of a troubled past and desperate for a stable job, she had taken a position as a housemaid without much thought. The salary was generous, and the work seemed simple, clean, keep things in order, and never ask questions. Mrs. Lillian, the head housekeeper, had been clear about one rule above all others. Never go near the West Wing. Your work is in the main quarters, Mrs. Lillian had instructed sternly on Clara's first day. You will clean the dining hall, the drawing room, the study, and the guest bedrooms. But you are never to enter the West Wing. Do you understand? Clara had nodded, but the warning lingered in her mind. The West Wing was an entire section of the house, seemingly abandoned, its massive double doors always locked. There were no signs of movement from that part of the mansion, no staff, no visitors, nothing. And yet, every night, when the rest of the house had gone quiet, Clara could swear she heard faint noises from beyond those locked doors. A soft rustling, a muffled sob, the sound of footsteps pacing. At first, she had dismissed it as her imagination. But as weeks turned into months, she couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that someone or something was inside. The unsettling discovery, it was a chilly autumn evening when Clara found herself alone in the house. Richard Whitmore had left on a business trip, and most of the senior staff had taken the rare opportunity to visit town. Mrs. Lillian, trusting Clara to handle her usual tasks, had retired early for the night. Clara moved through the dimly lit corridors, dusting shelves and tidying up the grand hall. As she passed the West Wing, she hesitated. The silence was heavier tonight, but there was something else, a presence, as if someone was watching her from behind the doors. And then she heard it, a whisper, faint, desperate. "Help me." Clara froze. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it echo in her ears. She turned toward the doors, staring at the ornate handles as if they might move on their own. She wanted to run, to pretend she hadn't heard anything, but something deep inside her refused to ignore the plea. With a shaking hand, she reached for the handle, only to find it unlocked. The door creaked open, revealing a dim hallway bathed in moonlight from the large windows lining the walls. The air smelled stale, as if it had not been disturbed in years. Dust particles danced in the beams of light, and the atmosphere was thick with something unspoken, something hidden. Then she saw her. A frail figure sat hunched in the farthest corner of the room, wrapped in a thin blanket. Long, tangled auburn hair framed a face that was barely recognizable beneath layers of exhaustion and malnutrition. The woman's blue eyes, once bright, now held a distant, haunted look. Clara gasped. It was Eleanor Whitmore, the woman the world had forgotten, the woman who had vanished. She had been here all along. A cry for help. Eleanor's lips trembled as she stared at Clara, as if she couldn't believe she was real. Tears welled up in her eyes, and with a voice barely above a whisper, she repeated the words that would change Clara's life forever. "Help me, please." Clara stood frozen in the doorway, her pulse hammering in her ears. The woman before her, Eleanor Whitmore, was nothing like the elegant socialite Clara had imagined. The Eleanor in front of her was a ghost of herself, barely clinging to existence. Her lips were dry and cracked, her skin stretched thin over fragile bones. The long silk nightgown, she wore hung loosely off her frail frame, the fabric stained and frayed at the edges. But it was her eyes that struck Clara the most. They were hollow, lifeless, and filled with something far worse than fear. Hopelessness. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Clara's mind raced with questions. How could this be happening? Why was she here? Who had done this to her? But deep down, she already knew the answer. Richard Whitmore. The silent prisoner Eleanor's breath trembled as she tried to speak. You're not supposed to be here, she whispered. Her voice was weak, as if the mere act of forming words drained the last of her strength. Clara took a hesitant step forward. Mrs. Whitmore, what happened to you? Eleanor flinched at her own name, as if it had become foreign to her. She wrapped her arms around herself and shook her head. You shouldn't have come, she murmured. If he finds out. Her voice cracked and panic flickered in her eyes. Clara's stomach twisted. If he finds out. She knelt down beside Eleanor, her own fear momentarily overshadowed by concern. Please, let me help you, she pleaded. I can get you out of here. We can go to police. No, Eleanor's whisper was sharp, urgent. You don't understand. He controls everything. The word sent a shiver down Clara's spine. Of course, he did. Richard Whitmore wasn't just a wealthy businessman. He was powerful. He had friends in law enforcement, in politics, in the media. If he could make an entire town believe his wife had disappeared without question, what else was he capable of? Eleanor reached for Clara's hands, her grip weak but desperate. You have to promise me something, she whispered. If you care at all, forget you saw me. Leave and never come back. Clara's heart clenched. How could she just walk away? But before she could speak, the distant sound of a door slamming echoed through the mansion. Richard was home. A dangerous secret. Eleanor's entire body stiffened. Her breath hitched, and in an instant, she pulled back into the shadows, curling into herself as if she could disappear into the walls. Clara's blood ran cold. She had to move. Now, she turned back to the door, peering out into the hallway. The house was silent, but Clara could feel the shift in the air, the weight of Richard Whitmore's presence pressing down on every corner of the estate. If he found her here, everything would be over. Clara turned back to Eleanor, her heart aching at the sight of her. I'll come back, she whispered, the promise firm despite the fear knotting in her chest. I won't leave you like this. Eleanor shook her head, tears slipping down her pale cheeks. He'll know, she choked out. He always knows. But Clara didn't have time to argue. She slipped back into the hallway, quietly shutting the door behind her just as the sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor. She pressed herself against the wall, holding her breath. Richard's voice rang out. Lillian. A pause. Where the hell is everyone? Clara could hear him moving through the house, his footsteps sharp and deliberate. She forced herself to stay still, to think, get back to the main quarters, act normal. He can't suspect anything. Summoning every ounce of self-control, Clara stepped away from the west wing and hurried down the hallway toward the grand staircase. As she descended, she smoothed out her uniform, wiped the sweat from her palms, and prepared herself for the performance of a lifetime. She reached the bottom step just as Richard entered the main hall. The man who owned everything Richard Whitmore was an imposing figure. In his late 40s, he carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from years of never being told no. His dark hair was neatly combed back, his tailored suit without a single wrinkle. But it was his eyes that unnerved Clara the most, piercing, calculating, always searching. The moment he saw her, those eyes locked onto her, like a predator sizing up its prey. You, he said, his tone even but laced with something unreadable. Where's Mrs. Lillian? Clara swallowed the lump in her throat. She retired for the night. Sir, I was just finishing up my cleaning. Richard's gaze didn't waver. He took a slow step closer. And where exactly have you been cleaning? Clara forced herself to meet his eyes. The dining hall, sir, and the study. A beat of silence. Then Richard's lips curled into a faint smile, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Good, he murmured. I expect perfection in this house. Clara nodded. Of course, sir. He studied her for a moment longer, as if searching for something unsaid. Then finally he turned away. "You're dismissed." Clara wasted no time. She gave a quick nod and hurried toward the servants' quarters, her heart hammering in her chest. But just before she turned the corner, she heard him speak again. "Oh, and Clara?" She froze. Slowly, she turned back to face him. Richard's expression was unreadable, but his words sent a chill down her spine. "Stay out of places you don't belong." A promise to keep Clara barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Eleanor, thin, broken, trapped. Every time she tried to rest, Richard's words echoed in her mind. She knew one thing for certain. She had to get Eleanor out of that house. But how? Richard Whitmore controlled everything: the estate, the police, even the people in town. If Clara made one wrong move, she wouldn't just be out of a job. She could disappear just like Eleanor had. But walking away wasn't an option. She had made a promise. And no matter what it took, she was going to keep it. Clara lay awake in her small room in the servants' quarters, staring at the ceiling. The shadows cast by the moonlight danced along the walls, but all she could see in her mind was Eleanor Whitmore's face, pale, gaunt, filled with quiet suffering. She had expected to feel fear after her discovery, but what she felt most was rage. How could a man so respected in the world lock away his own wife like that? How could he smile at guests, make donations to charities, and conduct business meetings, all while hiding such a horrifying secret? But the bigger question, the one that haunted Clara the most, was, why? What had Eleanor done to deserve this? Or rather, what had Richard convinced the world she had done? Clara knew she couldn't act recklessly. If she confronted Richard or told someone without proof, she could be the next person to disappear. No one would believe a mere maid over a powerful millionaire. She needed a plan, but before she could decide her next move, fate would force her hand. A close call the next morning. Clara moved through the mansion as if nothing had changed. She went about her routine, dusting, cleaning, and avoiding Richard's gaze whenever he passed through the halls. But something was different. Richard had always been cold, but today his eyes lingered on her for just a second too long. His questions were a little sharper. "Did you sleep well, Clara?" he asked at breakfast. The words were simple, but the way he said them made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "Yes, sir," she replied carefully. He studied her over his cup of coffee before offering a small smile. "Good. A well-rested staff makes for an efficient household." Clara nodded and quickly excused herself. But as she turned away, she felt again his eyes watching her, dissecting her. She knew he was suspicious, and she needed to be even more careful than she had thought. The locked door, again that night. Clara waited until she was sure the household was asleep before she made her move. With careful, quiet steps, she slipped down the hallway toward the west wing. This time, she carried a small tray of food with her. She had stolen bits of bread and fruit from the kitchen, knowing Eleanor was likely starving. When she reached the door, her heart pounded. Last night, the door had been unlocked, but now she twisted the handle. Locked. Clara inhaled sharply. Richard had locked it again. Her pulse quickened. This wasn't over. She glanced down the hallway. There had to be another way in. She carefully ran her hands along the wall, her fingers brushing against the old wood paneling. Then, just a few feet away from the door, she noticed something, a small, nearly invisible seam in the wall, a secret panel. Her breath caught. Could this be another way in? Before she could investigate further, a voice rang out behind her. "What do you think you're doing?" Clara spun around so fast, she nearly dropped the tray. Mrs. Lillian stood there, her sharp eyes narrowing. A warning from Mrs. Lillian. Clara swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. I was just making sure everything was tidy before bed." Mrs. Lillian stared at her, unmoving. The older woman had always been strict, but tonight there was something different in her gaze. "You need to listen to me, girl," she said in a low, firm voice. "Stay away from the West Wing." Clara opened her mouth to protest, but Mrs. Lillian took a step closer, her expression unreadable. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but if Mr. Whitmore finds you here, it won't end well for you." Clara hesitated. "Mrs. Lillian, do you know what's in there?" For a split second, something flickered across the older woman's face. Something almost like guilt. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. "All you need to know," Mrs. Lillian said, voice flat, "is that some doors are meant to stay closed." Then she turned and walked away. Clara stood there, gripping the tray, her heart racing. Mrs. Lillian knew. She knew exactly what was happening to Eleanor, and for some reason, she was helping Richard keep a secret. A desperate plea. Clara barely slept that night. The next morning, she made a decision. She had to speak to Eleanor again, no matter what. Since the door was locked, she needed another way. She remembered the balcony above the garden, connected to the West Wing's room. If she could find a way up there, she might be able to slip inside. Clara spent the entire day watching Richard, taking note of his movements. He left the house every afternoon for meetings, which meant she had a small window of time. Finally, the moment came. Richard exited the mansion, his car disappearing down the long driveway. Clara wasted no time. She grabbed a bundle of linens and carried them outside, making it look like she was hanging laundry. Instead, she slipped around the back of the house, toward the ivy-covered trellis leading up to the balcony. Her heart pounded as she gripped the old wooden beams. One wrong step, and she could fall, but she had no choice. Hand over hand, she climbed. The ivy scratched her skin, but she didn't stop. At last, she reached the balcony. With trembling hands, she tried the glass door. Locked. Panic rose in her chest. She had come this far. She couldn't fail now. She pressed her palm against the glass. "Eleanor," she whispered, her voice barely audible. For a moment, nothing happened. Then movement. Eleanor appeared at the window. When she saw Clara, her eyes widened in shock. She rushed forward, unlocking the door with trembling fingers. As soon as Clara stepped inside, Eleanor grabbed her hands, her eyes welling with tears. "Why are you here?" she whispered desperately. "I told you to stay away." Clara's heart ached at the desperation in her voice. "I couldn't. I had to see you." Eleanor shook her head, panic in her expression. "Clara, you don't understand. If Richard finds out, I don't care," Clara said fiercely. "I'm getting you out of here." Eleanor's breath caught, and for the first time, hope flickered in her eyes. But before she could respond, the sound of a car door slamming outside sent a jolt of terror through them both. Richard was home. Clara's blood turned to ice. She was trapped, and this time Richard would know. Clara's breath caught her throat as she heard the unmistakable sound of Richard's car door slamming shut. He was home. Her heart pounded so loudly she was afraid Eleanor could hear it. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to move, to hide. But there was nowhere to go. The door behind her led to a locked room, and the only other way out was a balcony. Eleanor's fingers clutched Clara's arm with surprising strength for someone so frail. "You have to go," she whispered urgently. Clara's eyes darted to the door, then to the balcony. Could she make it? Heavy footsteps echoed from below. Richard was inside. "Clara," Eleanor pleaded, her voice shaking. "Please. If he finds you here, he'll—" Neither of them had time to finish the thought. A deep, menacing voice rang out from downstairs. "Eleanor." "Richard." Clara stiffened as Eleanor went rigid, her breath hitching. He was calling for her. Another set of footsteps followed, lighter but no less urgent. Mrs. Lillian. Clara's blood turned to ice. She could hear them talking, though she couldn't make out the words, before the sound of Richard's sharp, impatient tone cut through the air. Then the unmistakable sound of him coming up the stairs. Clara acted on instinct. She turned and dashed toward the balcony, practically throwing herself onto the railing. The trellis she had climbed up now felt so much farther down. Eleanor rushed to her side. "You'll get hurt," she whispered, panic in her voice. Clara didn't care. The alternative was far worse. She swung her leg over the railing, just as she heard the door handle rattle. It was locked, but for how long? Clara met Eleanor's eyes one last time. "I'll come back for you," she promised. And then she let go. A narrow escape to fall wasn't as far as she had feared, but the moment her feet hit the ground, a sharp pain shot up her ankle. She bit her lip to stop from crying out. There was no time. Above her, she heard Richard's frustrated growl. He had entered the room. Clara didn't wait to hear more. She stumbled toward the side of the house, ducking behind the hedges just as the balcony door flew open. She pressed herself against the cold brick wall, forcing her breath to slow. Above her, Richard's voice was sharp. Why was the balcony unlocked? Eleanor didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was barely above a whisper. I needed fresh air. A beat of silence. Then, Richard's voice turned dangerously soft. I don't recall giving you permission for that. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, her fists clenching. She hated this man, but she couldn't help Eleanor if she got caught. Clara waited until the voices faded, then crept along the garden's edge, slipping back into the house through the side entrance. She had made it, but for how much longer? The trap tightened the next morning. Clara did her best to act normal, but she could feel it, the shift in the house. Richard's mood was dark. The entire staff felt it. He moved through the halls with slow, deliberate steps, as if searching for something or someone. Mrs. Lillian was even colder than usual. She didn't scold Clara or bark orders. Instead, she watched her like a warning. Clara knew what it meant. Richard suspected something, but the worst came during dinner service. The maids were setting the table when Richard suddenly spoke, his voice calm but laced with something far more sinister. I had a strange feeling last night, he said casually, swirling his wine, like someone was sneaking around. The room fell silent. Every servant in the room froze. Clara didn't move. Richard smiled, but his eyes were cold. Funny, isn't it? How some things go missing. A key here, a little bit of food there. He took a slow sip of his wine before setting his glass down. I don't like things that go missing in my house. No one spoke. Then, Richard's gaze landed on Clara. She met his stare, forcing herself to stay calm. His smile widened. Wouldn't you agree, Clara? Her pulse pounded. She knew he was testing her. She kept her voice steady. Of course, sir. A long, suffocating silence followed. Then, Richard leaned back in his chair. Well, he murmured, let's hope nothing else disappears. Clara forced herself to continue with the meal service, but inside, she knew the truth. Richard wasn't just suspicious anymore. He was hunting. A desperate plea for help. Clara barely slept that night. She tossed and turned, her mind racing. She couldn't do this alone. She needed help. But who could she trust? The other servants were too afraid of Richard. Mrs. Lillian was clearly on his side. Then an idea struck her. Detective Alan Graves. She had overheard Richard speaking about him once. An investigator who looked into Eleanor's disappearance years ago. But Richard had shut down the case before anything could come of it. What if Alan Graves still cared? Clara knew it was a risk. If Richard found out she had contacted anyone, he wouldn't hesitate to get rid of her. But she had no choice. At dawn, before the staff woke, Clara scribbled a quick note. Eleanor Whitmore is alive. She's being held at the Whitmore estate. Please, help her. Trust no one inside the house. She signed only with her initials, CM, and slipped the note into an envelope. Then, on her way to town to run errands, she stopped at a public mailbox and dropped it in. As she walked back toward the mansion, her heart pounded with fear. Had she just saved Eleanor? Or had she just signed her own death warrant? Clara moved through the halls of the Whitmore mansion with careful steps, keeping her head down as she carried out her duties. She could feel Richard watching her. Ever since his cryptic warning at dinner, the tension in the house had thickened, suffocating her. The staff spoke in hushed voices. Even Mrs. Lillian, always so strict and commanding, seemed uneasy. Clara wasn't sure if it was her imagination, but Richard's presence had become constant. He no longer left the house as frequently. He took his meals in the study, watching the staff with calculated eyes. And then, something even worse happened. The letter never reached its destination. 3 days had passed since Clara had sent the letter to Detective Alan Graves. She had been waiting, praying, for some sign that he had received it. But that sign never came. Instead, on the 4th day, while cleaning the parlor, Clara found something that made her stomach drop. It was an envelope. Her envelope. It sat on Richard's desk. unopened, the same handwriting she had carefully penned staring back at her like a death sentence. She barely had time to react before a shadow loomed over her. Richard's voice was quiet, almost too quiet. "I believe this belongs to you." Clara's body locked in place, her mind screaming at her to run, but she knew better. There was nowhere to go. Slowly, she turned to face him. Richard was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "How unfortunate," he continued, lifting the letter between his fingers. "You see, the postman is such a trustworthy man. Loyal, even. Would you believe he brought this straight to me?" Clara's pulse thundered in her ears. He had intercepted the letter. Richard sighed, shaking his head. "You've disappointed me, Clara." She swallowed hard. I don't know what you mean, sir." He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. "Lying doesn't suit you." Clara's nails dug into her palms. She forced herself to keep her expression blank, but inside, she was terrified. Then Richard did something unexpected. He handed the letter back to her. Clara hesitated before reaching for it, her fingers trembling as she took the envelope. Richard leaned in, his breath cold against her ear. "Burn it," he whispered, "and forget whatever foolish thoughts you had." Then he turned and walked away as if nothing had happened. Clara stood frozen, the letter burning in her hands like a confession. She had failed. And now Richard knew. Eleanor's breaking point that night. Clara slipped away to the West Wing. She had to warn Eleanor. She found the secret panel near the locked door and pressed against it desperately. This time, it moved. Clara slipped through, heart hammering, and found herself in a dark passageway. The air was thick with dust. The scent of age was filling her nostrils as she carefully made her way through the narrow corridor. Finally, she reached the second door, a hidden entrance to Eleanor's room. Clara knocked softly. "Eleanor? It's me." The door creaked open, and Eleanor's pale face appeared in the dim candlelight. Her eyes widened when she saw Clara. "You shouldn't be here," Eleanor whispered. Clara stepped inside, shutting the door behind her. "I had to come. Richard, he found my letter." Eleanor gasped. Clara nodded. "He knows I tried to get help. I don't think he'll hurt me yet, but I don't know how long that will last." Eleanor swallowed hard, stepping closer. "Then you have to leave. Tonight, before it's too late." Clara shook her head fiercely. "I'm not leaving without you." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes. "Clara, you don't understand. He'll never let me go." Clara grabbed her hands. "I don't care what he thinks. We'll find a way. But we need to move fast." Eleanor hesitated. Fear had kept her prisoner for years. But now, for the first time, she saw something else in Clara's eyes. Determination. And maybe, just maybe, hope. Eleanor inhaled sharply and nodded. "Okay." The air inside Eleanor's room felt heavier than usual, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Clara gripped Eleanor's hands, her pulse hammering in her throat. There was no time to hesitate anymore. "We need to go now," Clara whispered, "before he realizes something is wrong." Eleanor took a shaky breath, nodding, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. "Clara, if he catches us—" Clara tightened her grip. "He won't." But deep down, she wasn't so sure. The plan Clara had spent the entire day studying the estate's layout, looking for the best possible escape route. The front doors were out of question. Richard kept them locked, and the security system was armed at night. The servants' entrance was also too risky. Mrs. Lillian had a habit of prowling the hallways after dark, making sure the staff obeyed Richard's rules. That left only one option. "The garden wall," Clara whispered. "There's a break in the hedge near the old fountain. If we can reach it, we can climb over and disappear into the woods." Eleanor's fingers trembled as she clutched Clara's arm. "But Richard, he always knows everything." Not this time, Clara told herself. She helped Eleanor up, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders to disguise her appearance. "We'll be careful," she reassured. "But we have to go now." Eleanor hesitated, then gave a firm nod. They slipped out of the room, moving through the hidden passageway as silently as ghosts. A house full of shadows, the Whitmore mansion felt different at night. Darker, colder. Clara led the way, heart pounding, her ears straining for any sound. Every creak in the wooden floorboards felt deafening, every shadow a possible threat. When they reached the main hallway, she froze. A candle flickered in the distance. Footsteps. Someone was awake. Clara pressed Eleanor against the wall, barely breathing. The footsteps drew closer, then stopped. Clara clenched her fists, preparing to run if necessary. Then a door creaked open down the hall. Mrs. Lillian's voice drifted through the silence. "Sir, is something wrong?" Richard. He was awake. Clara's chest tightened. If he came this way, they were done for. She gripped Eleanor's wrist and pulled her down a side corridor, leading her through the back passage toward the garden. They couldn't afford another second of hesitation. The chase begins, they slipped outside into the cool night air. For a moment, Clara thought they had made it. The fresh scent of grass, the sound of crickets. Freedom was so close. Then a sharp voice shattered the night. "Stop." Clara spun around. Richard stood in the doorway, his silhouette cutting through the darkness. Eleanor gasped, stepping back. Richard's eyes locked onto Clara with a chilling calm. "I knew it," he murmured. "You've been planning this, haven't you?" Clara didn't answer. There was no point in lying anymore. Richard took a slow step forward. "You really thought you could take my wife from me?" His voice was almost amused. "After everything I've done for her?" Eleanor shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "You didn't do anything for me. Richard, you stole my life." Richard's expression darkened. "I kept you safe." Clara's stomach twisted in disgust. "Safe?" She took a step in front of Eleanor. "She doesn't belong to you." Richard's jaw clenched. Then his hand moved to his jacket pocket. Clara's blood ran cold. "A gun." "Run!" she screamed, grabbing Eleanor's hand. A race against time, they sprinted toward the hedge, their feet pounding against the damp grass. The garden was endless, stretching like a maze before them. Behind them, Richard's voice was sharp. "You can't hide from me, Clara." A gunshot rang through the air. Clara ducked, pulling Eleanor down with her. The bullet whizzed past, hitting the fountain's stone edge with a sickening crack. "We have to move." Clara gasped, dragging Eleanor to her feet. They ran harder, their breath ragged. The hedge was just ahead, a break in the dense wall of greenery leading to the stone fence. If they could just get over. Another shot, this time closer. Clara's legs burned, her heartbeat deafening. They reached the hedge, but Richard was gaining on them. Clara threw herself against the wall, grasping at the uneven stones. "Climb, Eleanor." Eleanor hesitated, fear anchoring her in place. "Now!" Clara pleaded. Eleanor grabbed onto the stones, pulling herself up with trembling arms. Richard's footsteps thundered behind them. Clara spun around and saw the glint of metal in his hand. A life-changing decision. For a split second, Clara had a choice. She could try to climb, or she could stop Richard. A fire burned in her chest. She had fought too hard to let him win. Clara turned and lunged, knocking into Richard just as he raised a gun. They hit the ground hard. The gun skidded away, disappearing into the hedge. Richard cursed, shoving Clara off him. But she clawed at him, buying Eleanor time. She could hear Eleanor reaching the top of the wall. Richard growled, his hands wrapping around Clara's arms, shoving her down. "You stupid girl," he spat. Clara gasped for air, her vision blurring. But then a new sound pierced the night. Sirens. Richard's grip faltered. Then flashlights cut through the trees. "Freeze!" Police officers rushed onto the estate, their guns drawn. Clara felt her body go limp with relief. The last thing she saw before darkness took her was Eleanor disappearing over the wall. Finally free. Blurred lights. Shouting voices. A crushing weight lifted off her chest. Clara blinked against the glare of the police flashlights, struggling to focus. The night air was thick with the scent of damp earth and gunpowder. Had she really done it? Had Eleanor escaped? Someone gripped her shoulders. "Miss, can you hear me?" Clara turned her head, wincing at the ache in her ribs. A uniformed officer knelt beside her, concern in his eyes. "She's in shock," he called over his shoulder. "Get the medic over here." But Clara didn't care about herself. She needed to know where Richard was. With great effort, she lifted her head. A few feet away, Richard Whitmore lay face down in the dirt, an officer's knee pressing into his back as they secured him in handcuffs. Richard Whitmore. The officer barked, "You are under arrest for unlawful imprisonment, domestic abuse, and attempted murder." "You have a right to remain silent," Richard snarled, his face twisted with rage. "You don't know what you're doing," he spat. "That woman is my wife. She belongs to me." Clara's stomach turned at his words. Even now, even in defeat, he refused to accept reality. Another officer stepped forward, his expression cold. "Not anymore." Richard thrashed against the cuffs, his face red with fury. "She'll come back to me. She has nowhere else to go." A bitter laugh rose in Clara's throat. He was wrong. Eleanor was gone. She was free, and he was never going to see her again. Eleanor's fate. "Eleanor," Clara croaked, her throat raw. She forced herself to sit up. Did she get away? The officer helping her nodded. "We have units searching the woods right now. If she's out there, we'll find her." Clara exhaled a shaky breath. She had to believe that Eleanor had made it far enough away. Far enough that Richard would never be able to hurt her again. A medic knelt beside her, gently pressing a cool cloth against her bruised face. "You're lucky," he said. "It could have been a lot worse." Clara wasn't sure if luck had anything to do with it. She had fought with everything she had. And now the battle was over. The final blow as Richard was hauled to his feet. He cast one last glare at Clara. "You think this is over?" he hissed. Clara met his gaze, unflinching. "For you, it is." A black police car pulled up to the estate, its back door swinging open. The officer shoved Richard inside, slamming the door behind him. And just like that, he was gone. Clara felt an overwhelming weight lift from her chest. For years, Richard had ruled this house like a prison warden. He had controlled Eleanor. He had controlled the staff. He had tried to control Clara. But now, he had no power at all. She closed her eyes, letting the realization sink in. Eleanor was finally free, and so was she. The Whitmore mansion stood eerily quiet. For the first time in years, it wasn't Richard's presence that loomed over the halls. It was absence. Clara sat on the front steps, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, as the last police cars drove off into the night. The officers had spent hours searching the woods for Eleanor, but there was still no sign of her. She had escaped. But to where? Clara's heart twisted. She had fought so hard to give Eleanor her freedom, but now she was out there alone, scared and vulnerable. "Where are you?" she whispered into the night. A new dawn by the time the sun began to rise. The mansion felt completely different. For the first time, it was Richard who wasn't here. His voice no longer echoed through the halls. No more harsh commands or cruel punishments. The household staff, who had once feared stepping out of line, were finally free from his grasp. But Clara couldn't shake the emptiness settling in her chest. It wasn't over. She needed to find Eleanor, and she had one idea of where to start. Following the clues after cleaning up and bandaging her wounds, Clara set out on her search. She remembered something Eleanor had told her once, in hushed tones when Richard wasn't listening. "If I could go anywhere, I'd go to the ocean. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere he'd never think to look for me." Clara grabbed the keys to one of the staff vehicles and drove toward the nearest coastal town, hoping, praying that Eleanor had found her way there. She stopped at gas stations, bus stops, motels, asking if anyone had seen a woman matching Eleanor's description. Most shook their heads. But at a small diner on the edge of town, an older waitress hesitated. "You said she looked pale? Thin? Like she'd been through hell?" Clara's breath caught in her throat. "Yes." "Have you seen her?" The waitress nodded slowly. "She came in last night. Didn't have any money, but she looked so lost, I gave her a sandwich and a cup of tea." Clara's heart raced. "Do you know where she went?" She didn't say much, but she asked if there was a way to get to the beach. Clara didn't wait another second. She jumped back into the car and sped toward the coastline. Finding Eleanor, The beach was nearly empty that morning. The waves lapped gently at the shore, the sky still tinged with the soft pinks of sunrise. And then Clara saw her. Eleanor sat near the water's edge, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring at the ocean as if it held every answer she had ever needed. Clara felt her throat tighten. She stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor. Eleanor stiffened. Then, slowly, she turned. Her eyes widened as she saw Clara standing there, and in that moment, the fear melted away. A choked sob escaped her lips. Clara? Clara rushed forward, pulling Eleanor into a tight embrace. "You're safe?" she whispered, feeling Eleanor shake against her. "You're finally safe." And for the first time in years, Eleanor truly believed it. 4 years she was locked inside. The maid's discovery left everyone in tears. Final resolution, the salty ocean breeze wrapped around them as Eleanor trembled in Clara's arms. For the first time in years, she wasn't locked away behind towering walls or trapped under Richard's suffocating control. She was free. But what now? Eleanor pulled back slightly, searching Clara's face. How did you find me?" Clara smiled softly. "I just listened. You told me once that if you could go anywhere, you'd go to the ocean." She brushed a strand of Eleanor's hair behind her ear. "So I came looking." Eleanor let out a shaky breath. I thought you might not make it." Clara's expression darkened. "He tried to stop us, Eleanor. He almost," she swallowed hard. "But it's over. Richard's been arrested. He can't hurt you anymore." Eleanor blinked, as if the words didn't fully register. "He's gone." Clara nodded. Gone. For a long moment, Eleanor simply stared at the horizon. The waves rolled in and out, steady and endless, like a promise. Then, for the first time in years, she smiled. A future to build. They stayed on the beach until the sun climbed higher in the sky, talking about everything and nothing all at once. "I don't even know where to start," Eleanor admitted, tracing patterns in the sand. "I've been someone's wife, someone's prisoner, but never just me." Clara reached for her hand. "Then start there. Just be Eleanor." Eleanor exhaled, as if the weight of her past was finally loosening its grip. "I like that." Clara hesitated before asking, "Where will you go?" Eleanor thought for a moment. "Somewhere far from here. Somewhere peaceful. Maybe a small town where no one knows my name." She glanced at Clara. "What about you?" Clara considered it. She had spent so long surviving, fighting. She'd never really thought about what came next. "I think I'd like to see what life feels like when you're not always looking over your shoulder." Eleanor squeezed her hand. "Then let's do that. Together. A fresh start. A life neither of them had ever imagined was possible. And this time, it would be theirs to choose." The final goodbye before they left the beach, Eleanor took one last look at the endless stretch of ocean. She had spent years trapped in a house that had felt more like a prison. Now, standing here, with the wind in her hair and the sound of the waves in her ears, she realized something. She was no longer afraid. Eleanor turned to Clara, a newfound strength in her eyes. "Let's go." Clara smiled, and together they walked away from the past, toward a future filled with possibility. And for the first time in years, Eleanor wasn't looking back.